Hello everybody and welcome back to the Overlap Breakdown YouTube channel. As always, I'm joined by my co-host Umir, who's a professional football scout and analyst, and we're here to talk about how Newcastle have won their first domestic trophy in 70 years against Liverpool last night at Wembley. Just going to kick it off by saying that Eddie Howe is now the first English manager to either win the FA Cup or League Cup since Harry Redknapp with Portsmouth in 2008, whilst he's also the first to do it in the League Cup specifically since Steve McLaren with Middlesbrough in 2004. And I think a lot of things have been made about kind of the English coaching pyramid and how they're faring, and I think it's a monumental trophy, not just for Newcastle in the broad sense of what they've been planning to do over the last few years, but also for Eddie Howe, a manager who's had so much go for him in the last 10 years and the kind of the journey he's been on. So I want you to just kick it off straight away with how you thought Newcastle were generally in this game, and then we'll get into obviously how they ended up winning the game.
Yeah, just we'll definitely dive into it in more detail, but I thought Newcastle were brilliant. I think we need to give Eddie Howe his props for the work that he's done, not only at Newcastle but at Bournemouth. Prior, a lot of people have spoken about how Newcastle have made big signings and things, but when you compare Newcastle signings and the sort of pound for pound investment on players compared to some of the bigger teams who have had far less success, then you look at Eddie Howe and you look at how his team, his backroom staff, the set piece analysts and coaches all work together to not only foster a club with this great harmony, but also this team that are incredibly physical and that have kind of pounced on the shifting tactical trend in football at the right time. And there's been a few times that they're not massively dominated in possession on the ball for long periods of games against teams that sit in, but that doesn't necessarily matter when in big games like this they can show up and show their ability to be adaptable and play on the quality of their numerous players. So I thought they were brilliant. I thought their team demonstrated a lot of their qualities that we've seen in glimpses, but it all came together perfectly for this final.
Yeah, you just spoke about how people have often maybe criticised Newcastle for not having too much of the ball but still fighting for the top four, and we've spoken about the shift almost in terms of where football's going in this kind of dual winning era. But Liverpool had their first shot on target in the 58th minute. They finished the game with 66% of the ball with 7 shots in comparison to Newcastle's 17 shots and from their 34% possession. And I'm going to run through now, just right from the top, some of the ideas that we've seen from Eddie Howe's Newcastle right out of the block. So obviously Anthony Gordon was not available for this one, so the front three was Harvey Barnes, Alexander Isak and Jacob Murphy. And what we've seen from Liverpool so far under Arne Slot is this sort of narrow build-up that me and Umir have often talked about on the channel. And this is something that has become a little bit tricky for Liverpool in recent weeks. And I want to basically run you through what Newcastle did to make this even more tricky for the Reds in this game. So as you can see in this image, we've got Ibrahim Konate, Van Dijk and Robertson stood over the ball in deep build-up, with Gerald Quansah being narrow, Alexis McAllister and Ryan Gravenberch. And what we have here is a settled 4-5-1 from Newcastle, with the midfield 5 being very, very aggressive, just waiting behind the midfielders to receive, with Alexander Isak stood just on Ryan Gravenberch, waiting for the ball to basically move from side to side. And as we can see in the second still, Van Dijk is telling Liverpool players to slow down and he's telling them to remain controlled, and the build-up basically shifts into this 4-2 build-up with Gerald Quansah and Robertson playing the traditional fullback positions. And then as we can see, as soon as the ball goes into Van Dijk, we can actually see Harvey Barnes springing from Jarell Quansah onto Ibrahim Konate, with Alexander Isak actually curving his run to force Van Dijk into passing it backwards to Kelleher. And in this situation now we can see how the press has moved to a 4-4-2, with Harvey Barnes applying pressure on the right centre-back of Liverpool and Tino Livramento, who's actually the left-back, stepping all the way onto Jarell Quansah in the press, and they go man-for-man effectively towards the end. But they're not going man-for-man straight away, they're using these triggers to then spring forward, limit the passing options to Liverpool, and most importantly, force them long and disrupt that build-up. And we've seen this multiple times throughout the game. In the next example I've got here, we can see how they're doing it from a more settled position, where Liverpool are a little bit deeper. Van Dijk again is instructing the build-up, stood over the ball, and Harvey Barnes once again has narrowed onto Ibrahim Konate with the midfield to go in man for man against Liverpool's double pivot. And the ball works it back to Kelleher, he punts it long, and as we can see when he's punted it long, there is no options on the park for Liverpool. They've got a man between the lines where the centre-half is stepping out onto him. We've got Tino Livramento who's stepped into Quanta. Dan Burns gone man-to-man with Salah. And when these long balls were coming in from Liverpool, everyone knows this about Newcastle. They do not give you any sort of glimmer of hope in the first and second contacts on these knockdowns. We've seen them even have this success against Arsenal, who are considered one of the best physical outfits in the Premier League. And early on in this game, we saw how they were forcing them long, winning the second balls, and then turning them second balls into direct transition attacks. And that is basically where it all started for Newcastle, and what managed to get them so much momentum really early on. And I'm not sure how you thought, Umir, but I thought in the first 20 minutes, I was like, Liverpool straight away had problems that you could see were going to persist throughout the entire of the game. And I wanted to ask you just, what did you think of this idea to obviously spring out of this 4-5-1 settled block into more of a 4-4-2 press and really push Liverpool back, but only when they'd, enticed it and they'd manipulated that situation for that to happen?
If you're enjoying the video and want more tactical analysis and podcasts, please press the subscribe button below and hit the bell to enable post notifications.
No, look, brilliant summary, and yeah, I think it highlights Eddie Howe's tactical versatility and his ability to create these opposition-specific tweaks that can win him the game. As much as it was a 4-5-1 that sprang into a 4-4-2, I think what really stood out was the fact that it was a settled 4-5-1, and that really worked for Newcastle throughout this game. I just want to touch on that 4-5-1 shape, that block more specifically, because I think this was one of the main reasons that Newcastle actually did win on the night. And essentially what they did was, they, even in the settle shape, did fluctuate a little bit between this 4-5-1 and 4-4-2, but the rationale with this 4-5-1 shape was brilliant in my opinion. They sort of used Joelinton as this left 8 in a very deep manner, and in that sort of 5-man midfield, they kind of shuffled side to side, but primarily with this focus on covering that left-hand side. What that meant was, because they were slightly more left side heavy, the passing angles, the passing lanes, the ability to find Mo Salah on the right-hand side, it was really difficult. They basically set out from the get-go to funnel Liverpool's play down the opposite side and take away much of Liverpool's strength in Mohamed Salah receiving the ball facing forward. We all know that when Mohamed Salah receives the ball facing forward with separation, he just needs a moment to kind of create a chance or to dribble up facing forward and get a shot on goal himself. And he was really nullified in this game. Testament to obviously Livramento's quality to jump and play quite intensely when the ball did get into Salah, but that was rare in and of itself. They shuttle play down one side really well. They covered that one side, and I think a lopsided defensive structure, given how much Mo Salah does do for this Liverpool side this season, is a really smart tweak. And we've seen that mid block. We've seen that mid block at play against teams like Liverpool and Arsenal, like you mentioned. And typically, those teams can't get past this brilliant mid block of Newcastle unless you've got a top passer. And I think Trent Alexander-Arnold, his passes in behind or his cute sort of slide passes to find Mohamed Salah were really missed. Eddie Howe's Newcastle certainly took advantage of that.
I thought Liverpool lacked a lot of quality between the lines. I watched the game in preparation for this at St James's Park, the 3-3, and Newcastle pretty much went with the same strategy to do this 4-5-1, having the midfield three really step out onto the pivot whenever they got close. And I think in that game, there was a chance Alexis McAllister had where he was popping up, roaming between the lines. But in this game, it felt like Liverpool had next to no presence between Newcastle's defensive and midfield lines, like whatsoever. And I thought Diogo Jota, for all of his goal-scoring qualities, didn't really offer that either. Luis Diaz had a few moments where he was trying to do this off-ball stuff, but we really saw the quality to get between the lines when Curtis Jones come on in the second half. I think it was the 56th minute. Yeah, and he come on, and I just wanted to show you this one moment, and it is actually after the Isak goal, which I'll go back to after I've talked about this. But Curtis Jones has the ball here with who's back against play, and as we can see, he's he's got as much pressure as you would expect from a Newcastle point of view to have on him, but he twists and turns out of the pressure, and then Liverpool's forward players are then 3v3 against Newcastle's back line. And I think this is just so important that when you're attacking space, you need to have these press resistant players who can turn on the ball and really get at a back line. And Liverpool didn't attack at pace very often throughout this final, and this was the one moment they actually created, and it was Curtis Jones himself who actually got on the end of the chance to force an absolutely unbelievable save out of Nick Pope, but it was his only save he had to make throughout the game. And I just thought it was just testament that Arne Slot does need to learn from these type of things. I'm not going to criticise him too much. He is top of the league. But we have now seen back-to-back games where he has been a little bit unfortunate in his decision-making, because I do think Curtis Jones does make a difference in these games to get on the ball when you're in set-up possession and give you a little bit more impetus. But I'm just going to go back to the Alexander Isak goal, and we're going to talk about something that Eddie Howe was doing, as you mentioned before, with Joelinton and Livramento. And this was, in my opinion, not what won Newcastle the game, but how you can attack so well playing so defensively sound. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's so hard to do these days. Have enough bodies in the box, but also have enough bodies behind the ball as what we call rest defence to win the ball back. And as you can see here at 1-0 in the 51st minute, Tino Livramento, he stood really high up with Harvey Barnes. And I want you to just look at the positions of Joelinton and Tonali in this screenshot. And we can see the difference between Joelinton having that little bit more reserve position, and then when the ball works it down to Harvey Barnes, Joelinton has still yet to cross the box. He's still behind the referee in this picture. He's still behind Mohamed Salah. He's there as a boulder to set in stone there for Newcastle. And then the combination comes from Harvey Barnes, Tino Livramento, and Newcastle crash Liverpool's box. Again, we spoke about it, the duel winning, the ability to win duels, and Murphy wins the knockdown on Andrew Robertson at the back post, and Alexander Isak with an exceptional finish. But I want you to look at the final finish just before Isak the final screenshot, just before Isak puts the ball in the back of the net. The two midfielders ahead of Joelinton are in the box. Tonali, Guimaraes are ahead of Joelinton. They have crashed the box, and that's just what we're talking about there. We're talking about being competent enough in defensive shape, so you've got the personnel there to win, and you've got the tactics to win, but also when you break forward, can we get bodies around the box? Can we get Bruno Guimaraes into the box? I think he had 2 shots on target in the first half, Guimaraes. Tonali had one on the edge of the box which just went past the post early in the first half after a long ball situation. And I think, as we mentioned before, these qualities of a manager to profile players well off the ball, on the ball, I just think it's one of Eddie Howe's best qualities. And I'm not sure what you think. We're going to move on to the set pieces in a minute, but just what did you make of how energetic and brilliant Eddie Howe's created a midfield where, you know, they die on the sword for this club, you know what I mean? So I just want you to talk about that midfield and the dynamics of it.
I just want to briefly add a little bit to the point that you just made, actually, about Joelinton before I talk about the midfield. But in looking at that midfield setup, we would obviously say Tonali and Bruno Guimaraes are more natural sort of sixes. I mean, I think they're all box-to-box midfielders, but they're more natural sixes than Joelinton. But Joelinton's the one in this game that played a little bit deeper when Newcastle were attacking with the ball. And I think that's so interesting because you would never really think of that when you profile the players individually. But the reason I believe that Eddie Howe has gone and done that is, one, obviously for his physicality. I think Joelinton gets up and down the field probably the best of the three, even though they're all brilliant at it. Yeah. And secondarily, when you look at the pitch, when you look at the angles and you look at the spacing, by keeping Joelinton back, Joelinton's playing on the left-hand side. So you've got an extra body in rest defence, somebody who's really physical and somebody who's really able to provide that extra body in and around Mohamed Salah. I think a lot of the game plan was for Eddie Howe to nullify those passes, and we've seen it on numerous occasions at Arne Slot team when they are conceding pressure, they'll launch the ball long straight into Mohamed Salah and he's running in. And on occasion when they did try to attempt this, you had Joelinton in and around that area ready to support his teammates defensively, especially if one of the defenders were to come out and try and apply pressure to Mohamed Salah. I think it was brilliant in trying to move somebody who's naturally a more attacking player, keeping them back, keeping them reserved to, nullify the opposition's best player and one of their best methods of attack. But like you mentioned, a midfield three that's incredibly versatile. They can all play, I think, almost all three positions. They're very physical. They're technical. They can press brilliantly. I think the understanding of knowing when to go when their teammates go, and also this sort of selflessness and this lack of ego to actually play defensively. I know in big clubs, teams want to have the ball, they want to play with a lot of possession, and it's what you do with the ball that kind of gives them joy. But for high-level footballers to accept that responsibility off the ball and to only have the ball for about 35 to 40% of the game, and still, revel that opportunity, I think it's brilliant, and testament to Eddie Howe and Newcastle's game model for that.
I'm going to let you cover the goal, but just before it, I want to touch on two more set pieces that Newcastle had in the game, which I thought almost painted a picture of the goal itself. And I want to talk about the use of blockers on set pieces. And this was something that I noticed right from the off. And when Newcastle were playing these straight balls into the box, they were using stoppers. So what I mean by that is a player standing in front of a player, screening, as if you want to use it as a basketball term, setting a screen for another player to run around that player whilst they're blocking an opposition player from coming and getting the ball. And they had a free kick really early on in the 5th minute, and they used Joelinton as a screen, and they used Harvey Barnes to do a 1-2 whilst Joelinton was blocking Jarrell Quansah from getting to the ball. And they manipulated this really, really dangerous situation where they got into the box in a perfect cutback opportunity, and I think it was an unbelievable block in the end. But I just thought right from the top of the game, 5 minutes in, Newcastle straight away, set piece plan, looking to execute the set piece. Everyone's aware of what's going on, and we often see teams waste set pieces. I think it's one of the most frustrating things in football for me to watch at the moment is people wasting these opportunities. But talk about marginal games, especially in cup finals, and this is like perfectly illustrated of what Newcastle kind of went on to do throughout the game. So it wasn't just that free kick, as obviously we can see from the next one in the 50th minute, how Dan Burn again, he stood on Alexis McAllister as he was for the goal, but this time instead of Dan Burn actually running onto the header to win it, he's the one setting the screen for Joelinton to cut it back, and then that gets Newcastle a goal, which was eventually ruled out. And I just thought the use of blockers and just the intelligence on the set pieces, I don't know who Newcastle's set piece coach is, but they had 3, 4, 5 different routines and scenarios which really caused Liverpool a problem in this game. And I want you to run us through the Dan Burn goal and just kind of jumping on the back of what I just said about the blockers and how they used them so well to affect that. Because I've seen a lot of people blaming McAllister, but it's not that simple, is it?
No, it's absolutely not that simple. I think generally they were all fairly unique set-piece routines, but they had the same principles that aligned a lot of them. And that was typically to get the ball outside of the 6-yard area, where Kelleher was less effective, where your Van Dijks and your Konates, who are imperious in the air, weren't able to affect the initial phase. And then to try and isolate some of your brilliant aerial set-piece threats against some of the smaller ones, especially if they've got a run on. I know we're talking about the set-pieces, but for Isak's goal, to get the ball at the back post against Andy Robertson stood still, and you've got Murphy running onto it, and it's again that same sort of principle.
Arriving.
Exactly. And we're going through some of these set-piece routines, and we're going through the Dan Burn goal, but we can see Liverpool set up in a fairly similar way to what they've tended to set up in their defensive set-pieces this season. You've got a fairly zonal block, and you've got your players set up in the 6-yard box. You've got a couple of players on the edge of the box waiting for the runners, and then a couple of people picking up players man for man. And that's generally a fairly standard and fairly sound defensive setup shape from a team defending a set piece. And especially when you've got your top physical and aerial talents in there, you can usually be fairly confident that you'll deal with most things. But like everything Eddie Howe in this game, and fairly generally when he does play teams at the highest level, he looks at opposition strengths and he wants to nullify them totally. So how do you get your best players in their best positions in set pieces without getting Van Dijk and without getting Konate involved? And that's why they came to these routines that had these outswinging crosses. First of all, there was a lot of outswinging crosses. When you think about the outswinging cross, you think, oh, look, you're losing momentum with the actual delivery. But the outswinging cross itself meant that the ball was going away from players, so the Liverpool defenders couldn't get their head to it, couldn't come out and couldn't step onto the ball. And then they played for the second ball, which is obviously easier to do so if you know that it's coming. And obviously Liverpool's players didn't. and so they weren't prepared. And then obviously the other thing is Dan Burn mismatched up against McAllister. That wasn't amended later on into the game, and then you have your big players blocking other players in that second phase, which allowed your likes of Dan Burn to get those actual contacts on the ball, and numerous chances. A brilliant general philosophy from those set pieces, and again predicated on maximising your team's strengths and minimising the opposition's weaknesses.
Yeah, perfectly said. As I mean, the marginal gains in football at the moment is crazy.
It's such a low-scoring sport.
Arsenal game decided by a set piece. Yeah, and it's just these tiny things, and they decide games, they decide cup finals just like anything else. Thank you very much for watching this episode of the Overlap Breakdown. If you did enjoy, please don't forget to like, comment, and share it around. And we'll be back next week for more Premier League action. Thank you. Bye.